We've had 4 years of intense debate in Europe. Parliament, Council, member states, countries, campaigns, people who would never know about biodiversity know about it because of this. So if I'm being an optimist, I'd say the 4 years of debate and compromise have probably raised the awareness of what this is and why we need to do it.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Marder. It's not often that biodiversity legislation grabs international headlines, but that's what happened repeatedly in 2024 with the European Union's new nature restoration law. It happened first because of the ambitious nature of the law, and then because of the political tussle around its rejection and eventual approval. Along the way, it gathered a trail of detractors and supporters, and has raised hopes as well as concerns, depending on who you speak to. The law's overarching target is for member states to put in place restoration measures in at least 20% of the EU's land areas and 20% of its sea areas by 2030. Brian MacSharry, who was also my guest for episode 10 on protected areas, knows all about the trials and tribulations of the new law. Brian is head of the Nature and Biodiversity Group at the European Environment Agency, and he's had a bird's eye view of the process and the law's eventual entry into force. He kindly agreed to respond to some of the critiques of the law, but first he goes into some detail about its content and its journey through the political process.
So first of all, it's a law imposed by the European Union on the 27 member states that make up the European Union. What the law really aims to do is it asks countries to put in place what they call effective measures to restore the environment, restore habitats, restore species, etc. in Europe. It has a target of at least 20% of the land areas and 20% of the sea areas covered by these measures by 2020, and then 2030, and an ambition then to have all ecosystems that need measures by 2050. And that's really what the law is about. It's putting in targets, it's putting in measures, it's putting in actions, putting in activities to really try and get this happening. And then you can break it down into how it's formulated and how it's constructed into different elements. And there's different obligations in member states or countries to do certain things, different obligations in the Commission to do certain things. There's monitoring, there's tracking of that, there's connecting it to the global biodiversity framework targets. But in essence, what it's really doing is it's a law to make sure that we improve the state of biodiversity, state of nature in Europe. And it's a law because we felt after many, many years of different, maybe slightly softer ambitions and regulations, there's a need to put something in like black and white and legal text to say, come on, we need to do it and we need to do it now.
And what preceded that? Were there similar laws in some of the EU countries, but nothing that covered the EU as a whole?
Well, there were. So, I mean, the background kind of legislations that we have about this are really what we call the EU nature directives. These are the EU Birds Directive and EU Habitats Directive. The Birds Directive is originally from 1979, and that was probably the first EU-wide directive, agreement among member states to do something. And it was amended in, I think, 2009 later on. And that really was the first step from a EU-wide perspective to make sure let's do something in a coordinated manner. Countries have always had their own laws to do certain things. So, my country, Ireland, would have done something. France would have done something, other things. So countries have always had their laws to do some things. Some of them might have been maybe stronger than other countries, but this was the first attempt by a more kind of a biogeographical perspective or a wider multinational perspective to try and do something. And then in 1992, there was the Habitats Directive. So the Habitats Directive, as the name would indicate, is really about the kind of the habitats, the ecosystems, and the species attached to those. And really what those two directives did, they created a network of sites called Natura 2000. There's currently 27,000 of these sites across Europe, covering 18% of land, about 9% of the ocean. And what they do is they get the countries in Europe to work together to protect these habitats and these species. And when you're creating a a protected site, you're not doing it exclusively for a local basis. You're doing it for the entire biogeographical region. So you could be doing something on the west coast of Ireland that is beneficial for northern France, etc. You could be doing something in northern Finland, which is beneficial for bird species going down to southern Spain. So there's been a long history of these directives and working with countries and assessing progress towards that and tracking the targets and so forth. But we've realized that we're not getting to where we want to do. So what we do with the European Environment Agency, we do this report every 6 years called a State of Nature. And the State of Nature is one of these things that was written into these directives, into the Habitats Directive. And it basically says that every 6 years, countries during that time period will monitor and report on the progress of their efforts on implementing these directives. And then the European Commission and the European Environment Agency will write a report and will assess where we are. And that's what we've been doing for several iterations. We've been doing the State of Nature. It's like a health check for the state of biodiversity and nature in the European Union. And unfortunately, when we do this, we see that the results are never quite where we would like them to be. The latest one that we did was in 2020. And the headline figures for that were that 81% of habitats were considered to be in a poor or bad state. And then for non-bird species, where we break it down, because non-bird is from the Habitats Directive, is about nearly 2/3. And the trend as well, which is probably nearly as important of the overall figures, was actually decreasing. For birds, it's a little bit different. About 40% of them are in poor or bad condition, so a bit better than the non-bird species, but about half of them have an either unknown or decreasing trend. So with all of this evidence coming in from several of these State of Nature reports, and the messaging is pretty consistent, the actions that we've been working on in Europe, which have no doubt have had benefits, they're not at the level that we need them. So in 2020, there was a new commission in the European Union. They created what they call a green ambition. So the political hierarchy said we want to have a really pro-nature, pro-environment policies because we realize it's so important. And one of the things that came from that was the EU biodiversity strategy. And that was the first time we put in this kind of language of, restoring nature. And obviously the concept had been around for a very long time, but this was the first time we said, let's put it into a policy context. And it was about improving our network of protected areas, improving beyond protected areas, and having what was called an ambitious plan for biodiversity. And it was really about reversing biodiversity loss. Because at the time, the conversation I felt had moved beyond the more academic perspective of we know it's loss, we know it's bad for us, but there was this the narrative had changed a lot into more economics about how the fact that, you need biodiversity for economic growth. You need biodiversity for us to survive. It was a growing realization of, the value of biodiversity. So around that time, that language was really coming in and highlighting the fact that, healthy biodiversity equals a healthy economy. And it put in a few basic pillars as to what this would be doing. And, we would have targets in certain areas. We'd have free-flowing rivers. We'd plant a certain number of trees. And, of course, then to go from an ambition, even from a very high-level ambition, to having something that's legal, that's when you have to kind of understand how policies are made at the European Union level. And that's when, I suppose, if any of the listeners have been following restoration, that's when they probably would have heard about it in the news. There was a lot of discussions and news stories about it's happening, it's not happening, it's happening, it's not happening, what discussions are. And the history from that was that, so in May 2020, we had the discussion, we had this announcement we would do something. And then, of course, you had COVID. You had the war in Ukraine that happened, and that changed the economic picture and the picture of priorities as well. And the need, at least in a European perspective, to say, well, we need to be able to look after people from COVID, these pandemics, what's going to happen, what's the economic activity, what's the health impact of these. Then with the war in Ukraine, it was like, what's happening with energy, what's happening with food security, food sovereignty, and so forth. So all of that meant that the very positive perspective of pushing biodiversity changed a little bit during 2020 and 21. And a lot of negotiations happened. And, when you have negotiations with different actors, things start changing. You have to have compromise. And in June 2022, the Commission, which is the executive branch of the European Union, had a proposal. They put something in paper and they kind of laid it all out, and they had the kind of the structure of it, and they had the targets, they had the ambitions, they had the monitoring framework, etc. And then that went to the Council of the European Union, and they agreed on the proposal. But there was still a lot of discussion about what was happening, about Parliament, would they agree on this or not? So what happened then was that the Commission, the Council and the Parliament had these discussions, which are called trialogues. And you had the Spanish presidency, were the president of the European Union at the time, and you have this rotating presidency in the European Union. So all these different stakeholders sat down and tried to come up with a compromise. They tried to say, well, where are we? How can we get the ambition going? And there was a lot of politicking happening at the time where, certain elements of the restoration law were being taken out and highlighted as saying, well, this is going to be destructive for farming in Europe. This is going to be blah. And then other people were taking the same text saying this is beneficial for farming in Europe. And it suddenly became very, very political because the ambition of it is quite dramatic. And it is really that the focus is not just protect, but it's to be very active, to make sure that you're restoring, you're improving the condition of something. And that language can be scary for some people. And I think that, there's an important need to be able to communicate these things to people as well. What are the benefits? What are the costs? What are the implications? So a lot of it was happening where they basically reached a compromise in November 2023. And in February 24, at the different sessions of the Parliament, they agreed on this. So then, jumping back into the EU political process, it then needed to be formally approved by Council of the Ministers of the Environment again. This was the kind of the rubber stamping. So there was a meeting in March of 2024 where this was expected to be, rubber stamped and approved. But a few days before the agenda was finalized in the meeting, it was taken off because to get this approval, it's not just a simple majority vote. There's rules about you have to have 2/3 of the population votes. You have to have a certain number of countries. So basically, there's a minimum number of countries that you want to have who will vote yes for this, and of those countries, they have to equate to a certain population of the European Union. This is really to try and balance so that you don't have, say, 3 or 4 very big countries agreeing on everything. So a few days before this, what was assumed to be a rubber stamping vote, it was decided that there wasn't sufficient support to put it through. So it was taken off the agenda. And then the last of this council meetings was at the end, late June 2024, on the 17th of June. And a few days beforehand, there was no discussion about this law being on the agenda. And normally you have to put something on the agenda so it can be approved. And on the Friday beforehand, it still wasn't on the agenda for the Monday meeting. And that weekend, the Minister of the Environment for Austria, and previously she had abstained from voting. But on that Sunday, she announced that she would say yes to it. And that vote alone meant that it was going to be positive. So on the Monday, it was put on the agenda and discussed and agreed upon. So that made it legal. So after 4 years and a month of discussion and negotiation and compromises, we had a law in place. And it came into force on the 18th of August in 2024. And when you look at the law, what it really says is that by 2030, countries will put in place what we call these, as I said before, these effective area-based restoration measures. So clearly, I will do this here, and it will have this benefit. And from the state and nature reports that we've done before, we have a list of all the habitats and the species that are in a poor or bad condition. We know the cause of that condition. We know the threats to those. We know why, what the different parameters that make up the different matrices that we use to analyze it. So we know the what, we know the where, and we know the why. And what countries now are going to do is they're kind of giving us the how they're going to do it. And the way we're going to track that is countries have to fill out what's called a national restoration plan. And in the European Environment Agency, we're working on that with countries at the moment. And there's a version due to be published in January 2025. That's just a really structured way to collect this information. By 2032, there's going to be a review of all of these plans, a European-wide review. So where are we in terms of the ambition level? So we will know the state of nature from this report that we do. There'll be another one in 2031. So we'll know where we're at, and then we'll know what countries are doing and can we track this? And in some cases, you might expect to see, yes, we can see some demonstrable change. In other cases, we might be aware that the changes needed are so big, they might take quite a while to happen. But it's about measuring the progress as to what they're doing with their intent and their activities. So it's really about tracking the progress, developing indicators to say, well, where are we with our ambition level? Where are we with our targets that we've set? What indicators do we have for that? Are we all clear in the language we're using? How does that connect then to, say, target 2 of the Global Biodiversity Framework? So really it's a case of how can the EU check what countries are doing in Europe to map the EU target and the global target? And then how can countries themselves track what they're doing? And some countries have been doing restoration activities already and been doing it for many, many years. Some have been doing it on a very maybe ad hoc basis. Some are doing it on a more coherent basis. But this is really how to try to get 27 countries together on the kind of the same page, in a sense, to understand what are we doing, where are we doing it, why are we doing it? And in some cases, there's probably a need to collaborate across countries to make sure something is happening.
Talking about measures, actions to restore, what is incorporated there? Because when one thinks about nature restoration, you think about an area which is degraded in some way, which is then restored. So, and that also, generally speaking, means that there'll be a change of land use back from the exploitative land use to a natural one. So to what extent is area an issue here? And I think this is related also to who within countries was opposing the law. And I've heard, in the news, you hear a lot about farmers and about agriculturalists having been against the law. And presumably that's got something to do with the fact that it means that some land would be taken out of farm production, presumably with compensation, but I'm not quite sure how that works. So what do you mean by measures, and to what extent does that mean just cordoning off areas to protect them as opposed to improving the quality of an area?
Your question really kind of, I think, came to the heart as to why there was discussion about this and some quite heated emotions about it. So, I mean, of course, one of the challenges that we have is land ownership. So in Europe and a lot of places in the world, there's a lot of private land. And, people have legal rights to what's on that land, what they can do, what they can't do, etc. So it can be a challenge as how do you engage with those stakeholders to really get them on board and help them be proactive in things. There's also a lot of state-owned land in Europe as well, like in a lot of countries. There's a lot of land already in schemes like, say, Nature 2000 sites or rural environmental schemes. So when you look at the picture initially, you say, wow, there's like maybe, in Ireland, something like 78% of land is privately owned. Wow, that's going to be a challenge. But when you start looking at, well, there is a certain percentage of land is state-owned. So I can definitely maybe look at this and see where it goes in terms of priorities as to my measures. Obviously, you can't just say, okay, everything's going to happen in those areas, because it may not be the right areas for the right reasons. But then you look and say, well, if I talk about the farmers, what are they currently doing? What are they being given funding or benefits to do? How can I tweak those benefits to help? And how can I improve this? And how can I discuss with them to show how this is beneficial? And a lot of cases, then the measures, some of them are very visible ones. So there's some on the removing barriers for rivers. That's a very obvious one where you'll be doing a kind of an engineering work to remove something. So that's going to be very visible. There'll be other measures such as re-wetting drained peatlands. That's going to be very visible, a very physical event. There's going to be a big long list of measures to help, because it's difficult to say this is the measure used for this, because you got to look at the local context. You got to say, well, what is the condition of the habitat? Is it severely degraded? Is it moderately degraded? And those things have different needs in terms of your measures. Sometimes you can be a bit more softer and more passive. Other times you have to be very, very active. Maybe a lot of engineering works, a lot of re-wetting. Other areas you might just say, I'll just leave it, go back to its more natural cycle. So there'll be a lot of nuances in there, and that's going to be part of the challenges of it. But what we're going to come up with is a list of different measures that can be used. And then countries will be checking those and using their scientific abilities and knowledge to work out which of those are the most appropriate for the particular conditions that they're dealing with. And that can be the environmental conditions, the hydrological conditions, but also the societal conditions as well. And I know that obviously the converting land from land use A to land use B can raise a lot of tensions. But what we've started seeing recently is a lot of discussion saying, well, in a lot of cases, these measures is going to benefit agriculture in the long term because you're having more productive soil. I mean, we're seeing this as well, that a huge proportion of soil, I think 80-90% of farming land in Europe, the soil is severely degraded. So that means that you're not getting as much productivity out of the land as you would normally. So it's a case of like, how do we change some of the farming practices to allow you to get a yield from the land, but do so in a more environmentally friendly manner as well. And we know that, say, industrial farming is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss and pollution. We know this. But in Europe in particular, we need managed farming because we have such a heavily modified landscape. It's different in other parts of the world, but in Europe, we've over 10,000 years of modifying the landscape. It has shaped us as a society in Europe, and we have shaped it. So there's been this kind of, balancing activity happening. A lot of the species-rich grasslands we have in Europe require grazing. You can't just seal it off and walk away. It's going to have a problem. So to maintain the biodiversity that we want in Europe, we have to manage the landscape because a balance of predators and prey is not there. So we have to put in some measures. So we have to artificially manage the landscape. And grazing is a great example of doing that where it's appropriate. In other cases, it's not appropriate. So in some areas, there will be rewetting of land, but you can still farm in those areas. As plowdiculture is used in a lot of places in Central Europe where you have grazing in these wet areas. And again, as long as it's managed and controlled, it can have a benefit for everything in there. So we will have a list of these measures, and they will go from the very detailed to the very general. Countries will try and apply those the best way they possibly can in the land areas that they have. The focus initially is on this network in the Natura 2000 sites, where I said 18% of land and 9% of the marine. And that's where there's already discussions with the landowners in those areas. That network consists of state-owned land, but also a lot of it is with private landowners. And yes, of course, if you're working to protect the environment, there should be some benefits coming your way. Like, how can we have the rural farmers and so forth, how can they be farming for biodiversity, farming for climate sequestration, farming for climate mitigation, and providing all these ecosystem services that we use, especially in urban areas? How do they get an economic incentive for that? And there are a lot of incentives out there. It's just about how do you rebalance those and how do you put them in a more positive perspective than maybe a more harmful perspective. And sometimes there can be these environmentally harmful subsidies. Can we twist those a little bit to promote positive farming in a certain way? So we will see in some areas conflict over land use change. That is going to happen. But I think what's important in those areas is to have a communication about what is happening and why it is happening, understand the different perspectives of people in there, because this benefits the whole of society. Yet there's going to be maybe a small proportion of people might be directly affected with their land use. How can they have a livelihood from this land that they might have been farming for several generations? They might be using, they might want to build on it and so forth. So where do you strike that balance for the societal need versus an individual need? And you need to do both of those. But this is where I think, with the Global Biodiversity Framework has this mainstreaming biodiversity perspective. And that's where you need to get that thinking in there, saying, well, this isn't necessarily a cost, it's an investment. There's been a lot of discussions about the return of investment for investing in biodiversity.
But I guess that return on investment is more at the societal level than the individual level, right? So I would imagine that the challenge is, because I keep on imagining the individual farm owner, especially, and how they can sort of relate to this. And of course, they'll be contributing to the greater good. But if you are an individual landowner, and let's say you're using, this is probably not typical, but let's say you're using 90% of your land, but it turns out that 50% of your land is, very valuable in terms of biodiversity, then, what is the situation that you're faced with? Are you then going to be legally obliged to set aside a certain portion of your land and do certain things with your river or the dam that you might have built? Or, what does it actually translate to? And I guess this is complex, but just as a generic example,
Yeah,
perhaps.
I mean, it's obviously complex and how law is enforced and applied. But with the law at the moment, my understanding is that if, Andre, you were the landowner, it's not, you've got no legal obligation there. It's how the country. So it is a law, so the states are held accountable for that. But then how laws are enforced and transcribed into national systems, that obviously has a discussion. And invariably what you have with this is you've got different laws affecting the same land area. And how do those laws weigh against each other and what the incentives are and how you have discussions and tribunals and how you have recourse to those different laws. So there is a complex legal landscape in there. But you are right, there's going to be certain individuals who will have, say, a land area that, the state might say, for the greater good, we'd like to do X here. And what I've seen a few presentations recently, there was a good example in southern Sweden where they talked to the farming community. It was a catchment area in southern Sweden. And they realized there was a lot of pollution coming out from the river and the different streams in that river catchment. And that was affecting the immediate one, that was affecting a coastal tourist area because there was a lot of algal blooms and the water quality wasn't bad. And they said, well, we want to improve this. So they worked upstream and they went, oh, we know the source of this coming in. And they spoke to the farmers and they said, well, we're not necessarily adverse to doing this, but how do we have a livelihood? So these organizations in southern Sweden, they worked with the farmers and they said, okay, well, what do you need to get from your land? And they said, well, we have a land area, it's, say it's 100 acres, and we get a yield of 10 from this. And, effectively that's what we want. And so what they had in this particular example, they had people go in and map the land, and they worked out that in one particular case, there was some wetland in there. And they said, oh, yeah, well, we farm that, but we don't get anything from it. So they looked at their land and they said, okay, for about 80% of your land, if you do farm in a certain way, you will get your yield of 10. And they're like, fine, we're happy. But then you've 20% you set aside for these different activities. And in this particular example, they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to re-wet this area. And what is going to happen is when there's a drought in the wider area, there'll still be water for your cattle. If there's a flood, it goes in here over your dry land that you're working on. So it kind of balances itself out. So they use that logic of sitting down and talking to the individuals and saying, well, what is a fair proposal for you? How can I work with you to get what you need from this and get from what we need as a society from this? There are then having other conversations about, if you're doing some work on a land, if I'm a farmer and I've got a land and I'm, say, re-wetting it, and that's helping flooding in the urban area downstream, that flooding has a very high financial cost to it when it happens. Can some of that be mitigated back to those landowners who are doing that? And you're seeing a lot of urban areas buying land and they're working with farmers upstream to have floodplains and paying them for this service because they know it costs them an awful lot of money from it. You also have discussions then about carbon certification and carbon farming in a sense. So can I manage my land in a way that is, say, biodiversity friendly, but also sequesters carbon, which is beneficial for us as a society? There are certain habitats that have a higher rate of sequestration, so like seagrass in the marine environment or some wetlands and so forth, and done in some areas when they're very threatened and in a very bad condition, they emit carbon and greenhouse gases, methane and so forth, so they're very negative for us. So if we re-wet them, you suddenly saying, well, you're sequestering carbon.
In one or two articles that I looked at, it seemed like carbon capture was kind of the focus of the nature restoration law. Is that a bit of a misconception on my side, or does it really seem to be taking up all the air in the room?
There's been a lot of headlines flagging that element. Climate change and carbon capture and carbon sequestration is in the restoration regulation, and it features quite prominently. And the reason for that is to really connect across different policies. Mm-hmm. And there's a land use change and forestry policy as well that talks about carbon credits and carbon certification. And what this is doing, when they created this law, they said, well, what other laws exist in the wider political landscape that we need to reference to. So again, this is something like if I'm a country and I've got an obligation under water and I've got an obligation under biodiversity, an obligation under climate and blah, and blah, and blah, how do I acknowledge those and connect those? And this is what this law has tried to do, is it try to identify where there's synergies. So where are you doing something already? Great. Get appreciation for doing that, maybe a carbon focused work, but it has a benefit for biodiversity. So, tick box, you've done something. And this is really what the commissioner are trying to do a lot in Europe, is say, how can we connect across these different pieces of legislation in a more holistic perspective and recognize that, I'm not doing something for biodiversity exclusively. I'm not doing something for water exclusively. I'm not doing something for soil, etc. But all of those have an impact, and they're not at odds with each other, but they're connected and they're cooperative. So within the law, one of the reasons for putting this language in there was to recognize that things are happening, and we should appreciate and recognize that and connect across and not try to duplicate it. It's also politically important to connect this, but also it's politically important to be seen to be doing things. And we want, if we talk about carbon capture for this discussion, we want to make sure we're doing something for it. And there's a lot of ways to capture carbon, but a good way of doing it is having a healthy, resilient state of nature. So what they've done for this, if they said, healthy forests, healthy seagrass, well-managed grasslands all absorb carbon. They capture it. We know that. It's a fact. So let's recognize that and connect it. And then again, the law as well, it flags then the kind of fact that by doing this, you're also contributing to an EU climate target. By doing this, you're also connecting to climate resilience and carbon sequestration and so forth. And the reason for that as well is that often you have resourcing being allocated to biodiversity, resources being allocated to carbon. And when you go down to the operational basis for a lot of this, when you go to talk about government departments or sectors or departments or agencies doing things, you start getting a bit more focused on what you're doing. And pots of money are used for A or B, but not for A and B. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do at the moment is say, listen, a lot of what you're doing has multiple benefits. By doing what you might think ostensibly is a biodiversity measure, you're actually having multiple benefits. You're having benefits for water, you're having benefits for carbon and climate change. So the headlines, I think, have been a bit misleading in a few places, but it's there because obviously it's important for us as a society to address. You put carbon capture on something, it gets the headlines, but it was really about making sure that it is a co-benefit and it's a synergy to what we're doing. And we know some activities may have a small carbon capture potential, but they might have a very high biodiversity perspective. But we also know there's a lot of measures are a very high biodiversity value, but also a very high carbon capture value as well. So let's celebrate those synergies and work on those.
To get back to the land issue, this again might be a misconception on my side, but overall, do you think, and this is kind of, let me ask a double-barreled question, would it be correct to assume that if the law is followed, then by the time the milestones are reached, that there will be less land in production in Europe? And if that's the case, then what about the ecological footprint that would need to replace that? The land overseas where biodiversity might be even more precious, which would have to take the place of the land that goes out of production. But the second question is contingent on the first, of course.
I think there's a lot of nuance in there. And I think you got to look at what's happening at the moment as well and what we use for land use. So in Europe, just over 40% of land is in agricultural production. And that figure varies quite dramatically from different countries. There's a lot of people working on that land as well. But what we are seeing is we're seeing shifts in production of agriculture and shift in demand of import and shift in diets as well. There are certain areas of land which are being used to, say, farm for food for animal consumption. So we're seeing with climate change in Europe, we're seeing that the outdoor season is extending. So there's less of a need to have farmed food for the animals. So you're having these changes happening at the moment anyway. So there is a change happening in what has been grown and why it has been grown. And there's a lot of debates happening in countries, irrespective of the restoration regulation or anything like that. It's about why are we growing this here? What is its benefit? What is its purpose? And the question has been why? We haven't heard a convincing argument. In Denmark, what they're doing is they're converting, I think, about 15% of agricultural land back into wilderness. And they're doing that for a few different benefits. The restoration regulation is one of those. But there is a shift in the need of what you can grow. There is a shift in what can grow due to the soil fertility issues. There's also a shift in the ways of farming. We're getting more effective in some areas at producing more yield with less area. There are changes happening in vertical gardening in urban areas, for example. Is that the solution going forward? I don't quite know. But we're seeing a lot of innovations in the farming sector that are changing irrespective of a need for biodiversity. They're changing the land use that is happening. We're also seeing there's a decrease in rural populations and a decrease in the farming community. And I know anecdotally from my own background, part of my family are farmers. And I was, when I grew up, I used to go to the rural area and hang out with all my uncles and so forth. In those areas as well, the children, most of them don't want to be part of the farming community anymore. It's a part-time job. So what you're seeing is that the average size of farms is changing. The smaller farms, they're no longer viable. So they're either being kept because they're part of a family and somebody's doing it on a part-time basis, or they're going to have to merge into a larger farm. And all of that is a way of saying that we are seeing these shifts in land use anyway. Restoration is only one of them. It's a small one. So we are seeing a change. We are going to see that there is going to be probably maybe less land in production, but I think the land that will be in production will be more effective. We know we need to improve the state of pollinators. And there's a big focus in the restoration regulation about pollinators, and there's an initiative on pollinators. And there's targets about, reversing the decreasing trend in pollinators, connecting pollinator-rich areas with these kind of buzz lines. And we know that in the farming community, something like in Europe, it's an estimate of about 15 billion euro a year is directly from pollinators. And that's probably on the lower end. So if you say, making up this, if you reduce the amount of farming by X% and you have it for more pollinators, those pollinators are beneficial for the farming that does happen there because it's more fertile. And then the land might get more fertile if you farm in different ways as well.
So, and you gave pollinators now as an example of a trend, a downward trend. In tropical parts of the world, virgin forest is being lost by the day. In developed parts of the world like Europe, is it the case that in most parts of Europe there is a slow improvement, but it's not fast enough, or are many of the trends still going down? And if so, why? Because there's this movement of people from rural areas to cities, and also increases in agricultural efficiency, et cetera, et cetera.
Overall, when we look at the trend of habitats for different taxa and so forth, the trend is decreasing. Their state, as we might quantify it, is poor in general. There are some success stories, of course, but overall, it's on the wrong side of the curve. If you can imagine a curve of where we want things to be, we're on the wrong side and we're going down overall. A lot of work being done to reverse this, of course. So that was kind of why we need the law. But why are we doing this in Europe when, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but could we just say, let's focus on the other parts of the world? I mean, we're doing this in Europe in one way because we want people to see the immediate connection between their landscapes. We want to see how you have that immediate, benefit from a healthy biodiversity near you. So again, Europe is a bit different. It's very agricultural. It's very forested in places, but 40% agricultural land, 40% forestry. Not all of that is natural. A lot of it's cultivated. We've got a very high population density compared to other parts of the world on the land use. It's very urban as well. So there's large parts of Europe where there's very few people living, and it's a very actively managed landscape for a very long time. But we see that when we have a healthy biodiversity, we know that it benefits the whole of society. So we should be doing something in our backyard to be helping with this. And not just saying, let's put all our effort into Amazonia or the tropical states. We need to be doing a lot locally, because a lot of it as well is that the nature we grew up around, it's part of our heritage. It influences us. Same everywhere else in the world as well. Like we're part of where we're from. It's, our influences, our names, our history, or everything about it. Our culture is very defined by that. So there's many reasons why we would do this, but From a very self-centered perspective, it's about provisioning of services to me as a person, as a society. So you want to make sure that you're having that locally, but you also want to make sure that by doing that, you're not putting the problem elsewhere. This is definitely something that has been considered. There's been a lot of discussion about, sustainable supply chains, and obviously supporting the global biodiversity framework and encouraging sustainable land use. There's discussions with different legislations and circular economy and so forth about, you can't really have that working in Europe unless you have it everywhere else in the world. What's the energy transition looking like as well? If country A goes off in this direction, how about country B? What's going to happen? So there's a lot of things need to be done with a global picture in mind, because we can't do something in Europe that just benefits Europe only. It has to be, what's our impact as a consumer? How can we change things? There's, the ongoing discussion with the deforestation regulation as well. But a lot of it as well is that the EU is committed to pushing the global biodiversity framework, the agenda of that. It wants to mainstream biodiversity in decision making. It wants to support that. It gives a lot of funding globally to do this work. It also recognizes as well that, there's no point in having, say, perfect biodiversity in Europe if it's degraded everywhere else in the world, because that causes challenges to us. I mean, we see a lot of the immigration crisis is due to degrading environmental conditions, and people want to go somewhere better. So that causes environmental degradation across the world, leads to conflict, and that can be very physical conflict, but can also maybe economic conflict. It can be changing trade deals. It can be doing this. It leads to instability and insecurity, and highlights risks. And a lot of companies and governments, they like stability, they don't like risk. So what we're trying to do in Europe, and I don't know if we're 100% effective doing it everywhere, we're trying to be consistent in saying, well, what we would love is a stable, risk-free planet. We've had 4 years of intense debate in Europe. Parliament, Council, member states, countries, campaigns, people who would never know about biodiversity know about it because of this. So if I'm being an optimist, I'd say the 4 years of debate and compromise have probably raised the awareness of what this is and why we need to do it. Could we do a better job of explaining the why? Yes. Could we do a better job of addressing the economic benefits to those who need them? Yes. But I think we've got a building block here that I think will allow us to do an awful lot going forward. And I think we need to maintain the ambition of it. And it's about mainstreaming it. If we really want to mainstream biodiversity into what we're doing in our thinking as a society, this law and the discussion and all of the challenges that have come from it, they've raised those questions about how you do it. I mean, all the debate about the land use that you asked about, what's going to happen with land being taken out of production. This is great to have these questions up front, because you know what the problems are. And someone is basically saying, I'm not disagreeing what you're saying, but this is the immediate thing. I see how it affects me, or how it affects my neighbors, or how it affects my local community. What are you going to do to fix it? And in a lot of cases, when you give an answer to that, they go, great. Okay, we're on board. Mm-hmm. But another thing I forgot to say earlier is that in the restoration plans, there's an obligation that there's a consultation period with the stakeholders on those. And that's actually a very important element of it. Mm-hmm. And this is something a lot of countries have been talking about. They've been saying, we really want to have these plans done soon so we can have this consultation phase with ENGOs, with stakeholders, with landowners. They say that's probably the most important thing that we can do, is the conversation.